This build cost $400 and it broke. I'm gonna show you how we built it, what we spent the money on, and why it broke. But before I do that, let me show you why I wanted to build this thing in the first place. This is a classic spot in downtown LA. It's got a ton of options, but also tight security. Because of that, there hasn't been as many clips filmed here as you would think. Here's some highlights. Augie Simoncini had a clip in the trip tape, as did Tony Nyer. Preston Oker manual 180'd it in 1030D. And Brandon Began did over X up double peg in his Ride BMX Pro part. I like that one in particular because I think the overgrind uses the spot well, being that it has the coping on the top edge. So when I was here about a year ago, I decided to try the overgrind. I got a few goes in, but we ended up getting kicked out by security. Fast forward to a couple months ago, I saw this photo. This is the spot. Obviously, it's not very rideable anymore. Right around when I found out that that spot was gone, we had an open spot here at this DIY with just enough time to build one more obstacle before a jam we had coming up. Trevor's the one who started building here, so shout out to him for letting me get involved and even take the reins on some of these projects. With his go-ahead, I jumped on the opportunity to build something that I could overgrind. The first step was to get down there and start plotting it out. The existing bank was already a great start, so what I had to do was come up with a way to make a grindable extension. I decided to make a 2 foot tall by 16 foot long wedge with a slightly steeper angle than the bank to give you a little bit of kick. With a loose plan made, I got started on the part that was going to take the most abuse, the coping. I considered using angle iron, but that stuff's not cheap and square coping wouldn't have worked the best for this anyways. So I figured out a different solution, spent the first $83, loaded up my truck, and got to building. At this point, you may have figured out I'm using these 4-inch diameter tubes as forms for concrete coping with rebar reinforcements. I'm making 3 5-foot 4-inch sections. With the rebar in place and the ends capped, I started mixing. Regular Quickcrete wouldn't have cut it for this, and without strong coping, the entire obstacle would be a failure. So I went with the 5,000 PSI Quickcrete, aka the white bag. In hindsight, I probably could have even gone for a higher PSI. The mold was filled, but I needed a way to get the air bubbles out. I decided to go with my roommate's massage gun. I let it sit for 15 or 20 minutes and then finished it with my magnesium float. I later learned that submerging these sections underwater after they've dried would have made them a lot stronger and probably prevented chipping, but hindsight's 20/20. 2 days later, I pulled the form to find a few remaining air bubbles, but now that I know what I'm doing, the second and third section should come out even better. Between making 2 and 3, I ran out of concrete, so I went and picked up another white bag and 2 sonotubes. These tubes are crucial to preventing the failure of the entire obstacle. You'll see why in a minute. The second section came out practically bubbleless. After floating the third section, I got to work on the next major step, building the form. This plywood made up 2/3 of the form, and didn't cost me a cent because it was part of a bed frame that someone left by our dumpster. Now on site, I started making the ends of the form. These are a template for the entire project, so if these are wrong, all the following steps will be wrong as well. I mocked up the angle I wanted, transferred it to a 2x4, ripped this board to 4 inches, scribed the angle from the 2x4, made the cut, and attached it. Now that you see the profile of the spot, you may see a potential problem. How's it going to be supported? That's where the sonotubes come in. There'll be concrete pillars coming off the back into the ground, supporting the weight of the entire extension. To do that, I'm digging 2 3-foot deep holes. This reminded me of bringing home bad grades in high school and my dad assuring me that I could just dig ditches for a living. Turns out you can't dig just any ditch. It's got to be a specific one if you want to get paid. Hole 1 was done, so I cut the angle into the tubes and got started on hole number 2.
Yeah, slide him in a walking battery in there.
Have you ever done a
spade?
Yeah.
I bent one yesterday. Was there any in there?
Still in the room.
Like what's a baby?
We would get through that.
Like an 8 or a 10?
The handle was already cracked, but I was running it into concrete. I broke the concrete out like I should have done in the first place and finished the hole with a flathead. Now I had to cut openings in the plywood so the concrete could be poured into the tubes. This had to be snug to avoid waste and blowouts. If you're not sure what I mean, just wait a second, you'll see. The plywood was sized and mocked up. Now it was time to lock it all into place. I dropped another $35 on metal stakes, bringing the total to $133. I also made wood stakes, but with how hard the ground is here, it didn't work that great. And I could also use a sledgehammer, probably would have been better. Once I got it together for the first time, I realized I was going to have to make some adjustments. But first, I made sure to drop a screw in the hole and take forever to find it. Oh, there I got it. Nope, not yet. This piece is going to pull it in a line. My plan is to mount the coping on top of the form. Each section weighs about 60 pounds, and the concrete we're going to pour in is almost 1,800 pounds. If I don't make sure the form can support that, the whole thing could blow out during the pour and all the work I've done so far would be lost. With that in mind, I added an excessive amount of supports and made a shelf for the coping. I packed in dirt around the tubes, but this tape is just extra insurance that nothing's going to move while we pour. Now, if we poured as is, the spot would have a lot of compressive strength. This means that it would be able to handle direct pressure with no issues. The problem is, not all the pressure would be direct. It has supports, but riding it on either corner would cause pushing and pulling on the areas that are unsupported. That's why I need to give it tensile strength, so it could withstand the tension of being ridden. I drilled holes in the existing concrete with the hammer drill. I cut pieces of rebar and hammered them in. I zip tied the rebar, making the coping one with the existing concrete. I cleaned up the edges on the middle section and attached it the same way. Once all the coping was attached, I did some adjustments using shims, and once it was all lined up, I locked it into place using zip ties. And lastly, I added one horizontal piece and one piece going into each sonotube. Those cost $15, bringing the total to $148 so far. Boom, tensile strength acquired. All the prep work was now done, and we were ready for the most important part, pouring. We buggied in 25 bags of concrete and ended up using 5 more not shown here, so 30 bags at $5 each is $150 worth of concrete, bringing the total to $298 so far. Our spot has no shade, so we start pouring at dusk to give ourselves as much time as possible to work the concrete. Little did we know this was going to cause a different problem. There's also no electricity, and getting a mixer down here would be pretty tough, so we use the tarp method. This is the easiest way we've found to mix as long as everyone cooperates. It's backbreaking work, but luckily Rex shared this little pointer with us so nobody gets injured.
Oh, it's about lifting with your back. Or lifting with your legs. Sorry, legs, not back.
I was lifting just
What the?
When pouring something like this, you're gonna fight gravity. To minimize slump, we mix as dry as possible and throw it in with a shovel. This redneck shotcrete way of doing it did help, but it wasn't enough to prevent what we ran into while finishing it. Once the form was about half full, we hit it with a 2x4 screed to even the thickness and started filling the other half of the form. We got the second half filled, and that's when we noticed a problem. I want to say it was unavoidable, but there's a good chance we started working the concrete too early. The stuff we just poured in was slumping down away from the coping, creating a gap.
Like just put some concrete in a bucket,
Like fill in the gap
fill the
and shit?
crack, yeah, just put it in there with your hands.
Luckily, we had a lot of help, and they got to filling the gap as quickly as it was opening up, while Trevor and I scrubbed and filled low spots. The gap got smaller, but we couldn't close it completely. There wasn't much more we could do with it wet. I would have to fix it later. Trevor started the mortar blend while I continued scrubbing and filling low spots. We called it around 10 p.m. and left it to cure, knowing that the next step was going to be fun, stripping the form. This requires minimal thought and even less precision. Just tear it down. The middle panel was the only one left, and I had to get creative to remove it. I would have used that oscillating tool from earlier, but that thing was a loner. So I decided to go with the upside down skill saw, followed by angle grinder with a concrete blade. That combo somehow worked and the form was off. It was this close to being ready. Just had to tie up a few loose ends and it'd be ready to go. Unfortunately, that meant spending more money. I spent $23 on shims and adhesive to fill the coping gap. This brought the play down to practically zero. To give it a better runway, we poured these transitions using 7 bags or $35 worth of concrete. I spent $20 on Bondo to fill the gaps in between the sections. In the future, I probably won't use Bondo for something like this. That was supposed to be satisfying. Spent $31 on Sealcrete. Usually I use lacquer to seal the concrete, but I decided to try this stuff and I'd say I'd use it again, especially because now I have a gallon. So that's $109 in expenses in the final phase, bringing the grand total to $407. Time to find out if it was worth it. I had a thought circling my head during the entire build process. Imagine I do all this work to build this thing and then I don't overgrind it. With everything taken off of it and the spot ready to go, that was now a real possibility. Despite the nerves, I grabbed my bike and warmed up. I started taking run-ups at the thing, trying to get comfortable, and after a while I realized I was getting comfortable with not doing it. I swear I did 100 run-ups and it became clear to me that it just wasn't going down this day. I actually filmed that, but I ended up deleting it thinking I wouldn't have used it. What I do have is this ice over that I settled for and then subsequently left disappointed. The overgrind was the whole reason why I built this thing, and that day in my mind, I failed. Fast forward about a week to the day of the jam, and at that point I was over the disappointment of not doing it. I just wanted to see people ride the thing. About an hour in, I saw Pat Frayne eyeing it up. I knew he would make quick work of it. To be honest, he probably would have landed it first try if he wasn't off balance. And seeing him get that close on his first try made something just snap in my head. I was just like, there's no way I can't do this right now. This is the reason why I built this thing, and Pat's doing it. I just finally had the inspiration I needed. One moment it seemed like the furthest possibility in the world, and the next, completely doable. Overcoming self-doubt in that way is absolutely the best lesson I've learned from BMX, hands down. Yo! The coping ended up chipping pretty bad, but that can be fixed, and to be honest, I wouldn't have had it any other way. You've now seen me win a personal battle with building and riding a challenging spot. But what you haven't seen is how we built this ledge that's designed for everyone to ride. Watch me build that here.